Hello people, good to have you here today as we continue our journey together through the Bible. This time continuing to look at lessons from the Law of Moses as revealed in Exodus 21, the follow-on chapter after the Ten Commandments. We're really taking a look back into the ancient past and the beginnings of society and the principles that God lays down. I do hope you find it interesting and helpful today. If you're here for the first time, why not consider subscribing to this podcast wherever it is you get your podcasts from, and that way you need never miss another single episode. That way you can make a decision to make the benefits of having the Word of God as part of the rhythm of your daily life. You join a community of people around the world in, last week it was 178 countries we've been listened to now. Community of people all around the world who've made that decision. But if you are here for the first time, please make sure you stick around at the end, and I'll tell you lots of ways that you can connect to this ministry and access the other free Bible teaching resources I make available in lots of different places. Anyway, that's it by way of introduction. I'll see you at the end, and it's bye for now. Okay, my good people, today we continue a new chapter. We're going to look hopefully at all of Exodus chapter 21, and I've called it Lessons from the Law of Moses. We all know in life it sometimes really helps to know and understand the law particularly of the society in which we live. That can be particularly important if you have a simple thing, even just like a car crash. It's important to know what to say and perhaps what not to say. But it's also worth noting that we, today, I'm sure most of you listening to this will live in a country that is to some extent, if not wholly, based upon the Judeo-Christian tradition as first revealed in the book of Exodus here. You see, the whole concept of legal and moral legislation was first revealed to the Jewish people here and was later adopted by Christians, and it teaches us things about the law, not only in terms of principle, but how to apply it. So the question is asked, what can we possibly learn looking at this thousands and thousands of year old text? What is it about the law we could possibly be of value today? What is revealed here, which at the very foundation of society, so to speak, what can we learn and what can it teach us about how we should think ethically and moral in our approach to the world and even our dealings with the legal system? Well, the answers are found, I believe, some really interesting answers are found here in Exodus chapter 1. Now, as I've said before, you need to understand, keep this in context. In the previous chapter, we've had the Ten Commandments given, that famous passage of Scripture. But now in verse 21, we saw yesterday that the first verse opens up by telling us the next stage of what's going to be revealed, where it says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them." Now this is significant. In chapter 20, we saw the Ten Commandments, and chapter 21 tells us that what you're about to read are some judgments, some practical decisions made interpreting those laws, those Ten Commandments, how they were applied in this early society. But before doing that, we need to understand what is the difference between a commandment, which we saw laid down a couple of days ago, and a judgment, which is being discussed here. And the answer is something like this. The commandment is the broad law, the principle that's laid down. The judgment are the situations that come up where the application of those laws, those principles, need to be applied. To say they're probably the same thing in another way and how it works in our day is we have the law that stands in statute as common laws, and then we have the additional laws. Well, in the UK we have Parliament or the House of Lords, then pass additional laws, and then even on top of that there's another layer of what is called case law. So the law as given was the general principle. The commandments as given were the general principle. And now we're going to come up with and see some very specific situations where you can see how that plays out. How that general law applied in that situation. And today that still happens, and in a sense what lawyers do is they go back and they look at and they study prior cases, previous laws, that's called case law, and then they will sometimes come up with a judgment agreed between lawyers, or sometimes, if it's more protracted than that, it'll involve a jury or perhaps a judge to decide how the general law should be applied in that principle, allowing for what is in the UK is sometimes referred to as judicial precedent. For example, the Ten Commandments, a really easy one, is the Ten Commandments simply said, do not kill. So how does that apply then? Should distinctions be made? Well, it did then and it does now. There are cases we all know where people deliberately and premeditatively decide to take someone's life. But the law recognizes that that is different from accidentally taking someone's life. It's recognized here in Exodus, and it's recognized in our judicial systems around the world today. The way we look at it today is one is called murder, another might be called manslaughter, and one might be called even accidental death, or causing death by gross negligence. But these distinctions, all of them, are rooted in the interpretation first seen in the Mosaic Law, and it actually starts here, if you like, the first case law in Exodus 21. Now, some of them may seem very odd to our ear today, so we need to try and reinterpret them at how they apply to the society in which we live today, but they still provide the basic principles. So verse 1 opened this chapter by saying these are judgments, and by actually saying it, it's just telling us that these are examples, some of this case law, so to speak, to help you think about how this might work out in the society in which you've been placed. Now that's what they were given for here, for this Exodus, this children of Israel generation, and we're still to some extent, well, to a great extent, thinking that way today. Now the plan is to, well, maybe not the whole chapter, but most of it. And I think what I'll do is I'll look at first 5 different cases that apply in 5 different situations. And the first case deals with what is referred to as male servants. And that is in these opening verses 2 to 6, where it says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and the children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. But if that servant declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, and I don't want to go free, then the master must take him before the judges, and take him to the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl. This will be a sign that he will be a servant for life in the household. Now, I know that can all sound a little bit strange, but this is the case, the example, where it takes a Hebrew servant, and you need to understand that what is being described here is not slavery in the modern sense of the word. Then probably a more accurate way to describe it is someone who is in indentured service. An indentured servant is someone who has been entered into or placed under a contract, an indenture, to that person's master. But what is significant about this passage is you can immediately pick up that there is no time limit to this. There is always a time limit. He is only to be indentured for a maximum of 6 years. After that, he is to go free. And this will tie in with something called the Year of Jubilee, which we'll get to later on in a few months. But the question is, why would someone do what we're seeing here? Why would someone be placed into, or even willingly place themselves into, this form of indentured servitude? And the answer is usually to pay off a debt. They would say, I owe a person this debt, so what they do is, I'll sign a contract with you to enter into agreement that I will be your servant, but that contract would always have a limit, and after 6 years the person would be free. So this indicates that people could become indentured servants themselves, or because it was a sentence handed down to them for debt, and by doing that they would sign a contract, but that means they would be obligated to that master, but within certain limits. So here we have a situation of a male indentured servant, and the owner has provided a wife for him, but when it comes for the time for him to leave, it says the wife should have to stay because the wife was a servant and the servant belonged to the master. and the master shouldn't necessarily have to lose both the wife and all the children that have come along since. However, it allows for a situation where if the servant wants to keep that wife and his family, in other words, stay married, then they could go and make a social contract before the judges, the servant and the master. And in doing that, the servant would have his ear pierced, and then he would stay as a servant and stay married to his wife. So the ear piercing was a symbol that this agreement had been reached. But then the master would become responsible for providing for him, the servant, and his whole family, and he would be responsible from the servant's point of view of continuing to serve that master. Now, we don't really have anything like that today, but I did read someone who said this is not that different in employment terms to a professional athlete who signs a contract for a team. They're under a contract in that sense, and they're owned by that team, and they cannot play for another team until the contract runs out. They then become a free agent, or they can make a deal with the existing owner and the existing team. So although that example is quite useful in terms of understanding the employment situation, of course it doesn't deal with the nuances of the family situation, but I think it's a little bit helpful nonetheless. So the key thing is, what in heaven's name can we learn from this today? Well, I think if you get back and take a helicopter view and think about the principles being taught here, well, if nothing else, it teaches us that all people have basic rights, even when they're being punished or when they've had to sell themselves off to pay a debt. They still have rights. There are limits to what can be extracted from them. And if they don't want to stay in that indentured relationship for longer than the agreed term, then that must remain their choice. They can choose to stay or they can choose to go, but neither situation can be forced upon them. So when I look at this case, the thing I walk away from the fact is that even indented servants has rights, and that is built into the law, which means everyone has basic human rights. Now, the second case is going to get even more convoluted and more interesting, and it has to do with a man giving his daughter to be married, and it begins in verse 7 and goes to 11. So let's hear what it says, and just, hang on to your hats a little bit. Try not to get too triggered by what we're hearing here, because it is more convoluted and more nuanced than it would first appear to the modern ear. It says this: if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. But if she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. But if he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now that sounds a little bit dodgy to us in this day and age, I think, because it really appears, it looks like this daughter's being sold. Except the next verse indicates that this is all to do with marriage. If you notice, the verse 8 says, he betrothed her to himself. So this is a case of what we would today describe as an arranged marriage, which was the norm across all societies at that time that this was written. But God is adding some extra factors into if this is being done, how this is being done in this day and age. In this situation, we see a father and a suitor make a deal that this is going to happen in the future, as was the norm at that time. So this is what we would today call an arranged marriage. And you need to remember that that still goes on in some parts of the world to this day. But in this situation, this means if the husband, the prospective husband, decides he doesn't like the girl that he's been promised to, so this is at the point at which he would take her fully as his wife, then he doesn't have the right to sell her on to someone else. He can either accept her or she has to be redeemed, set free, so she can go back home. He can't simply pass her on to any other random person or make any financial arrangements to pass her on. Now, I know this is a little bit confusing and challenging from our point of view, because it then talks about him betrothing her to his son instead. But that means that if the master's son subsequently came alongside and said he wanted to take her and treat her as his wife, not as a concubine, please note, she then must be allowed, and can only be allowed, to become a fully fledged wife, and she must no longer be treated as a servant in any way. And by doing that, she must gain all the rights of a wife. Even if she had been a servant before, she gains the rights and becomes a free woman. So I think the point of all this is, very simply, the principle is you can't treat your wife or your daughter as a servant or a slave. You see, this is setting a limit on what can go on here. Remember, this is at a time when multiple wives were commonplace. Arranged marriages were commonplace among the tribes and nations of that time. But this sets some very strict rules and limitations in relation particularly to a daughter becoming a wife, and saying that the husband, the new husband, any potential husband, can't treat her any way he wants. If she becomes his wife, she must gain the full rights as a wife, and he has to treat her as a wife and as a fully fledged person and human being. So the takeaway in this case is that even in the arranged marriages that were allowed at that time, that women had rights and that they must always be treated with dignity and respect, which, believe you me, was the opposite of the normal standard of that day. Anyway, moving on, the next case is verses 12 to 14, and it deals with something a little more juicy, shall we say, the crime of murder. And it says, anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it was not done intentionally, but God allowed it to happen, then they are to flee to a place that I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken away from my altar and put to death. You see, when God gave the 10 Commandments, as I said, they were broad principle laws. But then there would be cases that would come along where you would have to apply that law, and clearly one of such type cases is one of murder. Sometimes things are not very clear-cut cases. If it is a clear-cut case, if someone kills someone and they planned it, then they should be put to death under the Mosaic law. That one, of course, is fairly straightforward. But, of course, we would also see that more complicated situations will arise. So they're discussed also. And another example of that complication is found in our fourth case that we look at, which deals with the crime of assaulting parents and how that links into what has just gone before. In verses 15, it says, anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. Now, these to our modern ears seem pretty severe punishments, don't they? But I suppose the principle it's showing is how seriously God takes family and fairness among people. You see, right from the beginning, God is saying, look, the family is going to be the basis of this new society. And if you don't have a healthy, respectful family, then you're not going to have a healthy society. So God wants to preserve and protect the family in this new nation he has chosen to be his people. And one way, I suppose, of protecting the family is to have these very strict limits on what can be done, undermined by the threat of putting to death those who use violence to undermine the structure of the family and society in that way. Now, of course, that basic standard, we would say, remain today in the fact that we should still respect and honour our parents. And I believe that's a good thing. And if nothing else, it points out that sometimes it's not easy to apply these things, but it's very important that the family maintain and represent the high point of how God expects us to live together as a nation, as a people. Okay, the fifth case, verses 18 and 19, it deals with other cases of assault and where those grey lines and the waters are muddied in the difference between murder, premeditated murder, and other things that might happen. And it tells us this: if people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist and the victim does not die, but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around without a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and must see that the victim is completely healed. So here we have a case where two men get into a fight and one of them strikes the others, and clearly he's injured, but he doesn't die. But the one who struck him, well, he's not put to death, but do you see, he has to compensate the injured person for both his loss of time and provide for the costs of any medical care that he needed until he's completely healed. So this is a case where there's no intention to kill, it's just violent disorder, if you like, and it doesn't result in a death. And of course that is saying that this is not to be defined as murder and has got to be treated differently. It's not a capital offence under the Mosaic law, but still the person who caused the injury is still responsible for the consequences of their actions, and they need to make full restitution. So what can we learn from these cases? Well, we can learn that the laws are there to protect people, and particularly this one, to preserve the sanctity of life, to ensure there's injustice at every level, and to ensure people are compensated if they're physically assaulted, and all of them will help underpin and promote a healthy society. And these cases also show that there are different levels of offences that need to be taken into account, and that the punishment should fit the crime. And they also emphasise the importance of overall always remember to treat other people with dignity and respect, even when it's an indentured servant or someone put into an arranged marriage, or even to injustice involved in arbitrating any form of physical altercation where violence has been used. These laws are all there to represent the principle of justice and are foundational to this day still to our sense of justice and how it applies in the world in which we live today. Now, it's worth noting that these laws were given specifically to the ancient Israelites as part of their legal system at that time. And in terms of the commandments, of course, they still apply, but in terms of the applications, there are certainly valuable insights and underlying principles of justice and human rights to be appreciated and applied. But we need to recognize that the application of those laws may vary in different cultural and legal contexts around the world today, just as they did with the nuances that he's unpacking in the different ways they are applied at that time. Of course, by today's standards, some of these laws sound really harsh, and that's because we've instituted laws that go beyond some of the things described here and added more tiers and the more nuanced way of approaching these things in the complicated world in which we live today. But the underlying thing that you need to bear in mind that compared to the laws of this day and the codes around the Middle East at this time, those ideas and principles practiced outside the nation of Israel, these laws and principles are very tame and very fair by comparison. They're much more humane than the laws that were coming from the pagan societies around them at that time. Now, it's going to get really interesting because look at verse 20, because it gives another situation. It says this: anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers from it after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Now, this one is going to be really tricky to modern ears, but it also gets interesting because look at what follows in the next couple of verses. It's putting it in a wider context, and it says also if people are fighting and hit each other and a pregnant woman gets hit and she gives birth prematurely but has no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there's a serious injury, you are to take a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. Okay, let's think about this for a minute. Here we have two men who get into a fist fight, and a pregnant woman who's there or around that scene also gets hurt in the fracas. This sounds a bit like my local pub on a Saturday night, or an episode in a soap opera. The woman is, as described, is pretty much an innocent bystander, but because of the fight happening, she gets hurt. And as a result of it, in this situation, she gives birth to their baby prematurely. But it says if neither her nor the baby are harmed, and it's a healthy birth, then what happens is the man who caused the situation, well, he still has to pay something, even in that circumstance. And what he has to pay is determined by an agreement between the husband of the woman and the civil authorities, the judges appointed over the people, and that man will be obliged to pay some kind of fine because his actions were deemed to have caused her to give birth prematurely. And that is applied even if no apparent harm followed. But then what if harm follows? What happens if there's some other harm and a result, maybe the woman herself is injured, or the result of a premature birth, the baby is born with a disability, or the woman just simply falls and gets hurt? Then it says the offender, the man or men involved in the fracas, they should receive stripes to the same degree as the woman or the child was harmed. So whatever their harm caused is to be their penalty applied to them. This sounds a bit to me like the principle we have in the UK, where you see lawyers advertising on TV saying where there's blame, there's a claim. This is what lies at the heart of the concept. This is the call for a strict, yes, but a fair justice. So if you cause the person to die, you die. If you cause the person to lose an eye, you lose an eye. If you cause the person to lose a tooth, you lose a tooth. And it goes through this list of equal crimes and punishment. If they're burned, you're burned. If that person, what's described as experiences stripes in any way, in other words, is injured in any way, then you will be given stripes also. It's a case of tit for tat, or maybe a better way of describing it is fair justice. Even to the point, if one of them dies, you too shall die. All right, we'll close off now in these last few verses, a few more examples. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it, the slave must go free to compensate for the loss of the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must also let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So the servant in this situation goes free. Now that, within the laws of that time, is an incredibly harsh punishment for something that could have happened very easily based on the level of violence sometimes meted out against indentured servants and slaves. So obviously, within God's revealing his plan for the nation of Israel he's establishing, this is a huge step change in discouraging physical abuse. If you're simply just to strike a servant or slave in this case, and if they suffer any type of harm, even something like simply losing a tooth, in response you must grant him or her their freedom. And one more, verse 28. This is an interesting one. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and the meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of going out, and the owner has been warned, but it has not kept it penned up, and it then goes out and kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its owner is also to be put to death. Okay, this is a complicated one, but the principle still applies today. This is a case where a bull or an ox goes out and it gores a neighbour, and that neighbour is killed. Then in that circumstance, if it's a one-off event, you don't have to pay a fine. Now, I know that sounds contrary to everything that we've sort of heard so far. Everything seems to have been about pointing to the fact that you're responsible for these situations, but now all of a sudden, verse 28, it doesn't seem to be the case. But in order to understand verse 28, you need to hold it a lot and read it alongside the next verse, which says, but if the ox tended to be aggressive in the past, and that it had been known to the owner, and they'd not chosen to confine it, then if they kill a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned. Well, that's the equivalent of an animal being put down, being put to death, and the owner also shall be put to death. So in the first example, it's talking about an animal that you'd no way of knowing had the potential to kill someone, and it says in that case, you're not actually liable. But then this huge step change that if you know that the animal in the past has a violent history, has gored people, attacked people, and you have chosen not to confine it, then you are responsible because you didn't take reasonable steps to prevent that happening. You are responsible for that death, and then that becomes a capital offence. So the difference between these two situations is the little key phrase that lies between verse 28 and 29, where it says, "And it had not been known to the owner that it had been violent." But then, even if the capital offence is exacted, it tells us in the following verses, however, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. The law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter, or if the bull gores a male or female slave. The owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. So the violent animal, in all circumstances, if it's got a history, is to be put down. But what it's saying here is very simply that the penalty, the capital penalty, the potential death sentence on the owner of this violent animal can be redeemed or reduced to a fine. And that fine is agreed between the offended person and the judge and the owner. And even if it's a servant who is injured, then the minimum standard is that it can be bailed for 30 shekels of silver. Interesting to note who got 30 shekels of silver. Does that ring a bell? Judas, of course, for his betrayal of Jesus. So as an aside, what he got for betraying the Lord was the price of a slave. I find that interesting. Okay, what we've had here is thousands of year old archaic legal rules applied at that time and what they still mean for us today. So let me see if I can try and sum all this up. Because what I'm saying, and what I believe this is saying, is that ultimately it's just saying everyone, all people have rights. Rights regarding the cause of bodily injury or assault, from the most everyday of occurrences right up to and including injury that may cause death and murder. And that in all situations there must be reparations, a penalty must be paid. And ultimately, for some offences, the ultimate payment, capital punishment, is the ultimate payment for what was deemed what we would today call premeditated, pre-planned first-degree murder. But the real point of this passage is the big picture that it's trying to get across is that all punishments must be commensurate with the crime. This is the one thing I think we need to get out of it, is that any punishment should be commensurate with the crime. There's a limit set on them and you can't go above that limit. Now that can be at this time revealed as an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. You cause a loss, you experience a loss, and that is the strict justice that God reveals here. Now you need to remember, like I said before, the society to which this new code of principle was revealed, because in the ancient world, in many places, there was no such even nod towards fair justice of any sort. And even in the modern world today, this principle is not always applied. There is, in fact, injustice masquerading under the name of justice. In some places, for example, if you steal, instead of having to pay the money back you stealed, you get your hand chopped off. And that is a punishment that is clearly not commensurate with the crime. What the scripture teaches here is the principle being that the upper limit set must be the setting of a punishment being commensurate with the crime. The limit of justice can never be any more than an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but it can be set below that if you wish. There is something in the Bible called justice, and it is fair justice. And let me make one more final observation, an important one for us to understand how this applies and what it means today. Today, a just society is governed by the rule of the law, not by the rule of the ruler. May I repeat that? Because still in totalitarian states around the world to this day, there are people who don't apply it in this way. So I'll repeat it. A just society is governed by the principles of the rule of law, not the ruler. So no one can be above the law. God created societies to be just societies. Well, they're supposed to be anyway. And we believe that within those societies ordained by God, we are governed by the rules and principles of law, and not, as in times past, just by the current ruler. So what we need to do is simply establish the law, apply it evenly, apply it fairly, don't exceed the limits of the law, and try as best we can to live by it. Okay, friends, today we continue our time together studying the Mosaic Law as revealed in Exodus chapter 21. Now, as you know, the Bible teaches that believers today are not under this thing called the Mosaic Law. However, it does tell us that the Old Testament is written for our learning and our benefit, and we know that because Paul, in fact, said so, among others. So whilst we're not directly under its conviction, so to speak, we can still learn a lot from it. And hopefully that's what we'll do today. And the example being today is, well, in Exodus 21, what we remember just a few episodes ago that we had the 10 Commandments revealed to us, one of which was thou shalt not steal. And today we're going to delve into the ramifications of that. How does it apply? More specifically, not just how did it apply then, but how does it work for us today? And we're going to look at some example it gives in how they applied that law in the society then. So remember, just recently, for the people receiving this, in the previous chapter, we had seen God giving Moses the 10 Commandments. But beginning in chapter 1, he said, these are the judgments that he has set before us. In other words, the 10 Commandments were given to give the broad principles, and then beginning in this chapter, he's going to give us specific examples of how those laws apply. And that process we began looking at yesterday, and that is going to go on actually for 4 chapters from chapter 21 through to 24. So we already looked at the first section together. I think I'm going to put it into the 4 sections, not exactly matching the chapter breaks, but rather the thematic breaks. And we began yesterday and covered 21 verses 1 to 32. And today we're going to pick up in chapter 21 verse 33, and we're going to bridge over into the next chapter down to 22:15. So in the first section, we read and heard yesterday and saw the guidelines in application of the commandments pertaining the harming or killing of people. And in the second section, he's dealing with laws pertaining, well, pretty much to the loss of property. So you could say the same thing another way and say the first section we looked at yesterday dealt with sin against the person, and today we're going to be looking at issues that deal with sins against property, the loss of a person's property and the consequences of that. And in this section on property, he's going to give us 4 culturally relevant situations for that time and the penalties that apply and the consequences of how they differ in those cases. So having said what they're about to say will appear relatively simple, the thing to look out for today is what is missing. The thing that's not there, I think, is worth paying attention to. As we move through the passage, try and figure out what's different then as opposed to today in terms of it's not there as a type of censure. Because I actually believe it's not so much this passage says that's really significant, it's what is omitted. Anyway, hang on, we'll see if we can work that out together. So let's start chapter 21 verse 33 to verse 36, and it's going to talk about the loss of property due to neglect. Somebody's neglected to watch out for a property of another person, and as a result of that, that item or that property was lost. So let's look at the first one. I'll read to you a couple of verses beginning in verse 33. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal exchange. All right, that's the situation. How might that apply today? Well, maybe you could think about if you did a similar thing. For example, you dug a hole in your garden or on your land to put something like a swimming pool in. And you dig this hole and you don't bother to cover it up, and someone comes along or falls right into it. Similar thing is when you hire a skip to take rubbish away in this country. You're supplied with all sorts of bollards and cones and even lights to flash at night in case anybody were to drive into it or to walk into it and not notice it was there. So here we have a principle. Remember, this has been written 3,500 years ago, and in all of these situations the advice will still be good and will still stand. We just need to culturally reinterpret it to how it might apply in this day and age. The law is saying here that if you don't cover a pit, and in this case the example is of a neighbour's ox comes along and falls down into the hole and dies, then you are responsible for the loss of that ox. Simply put, because of your neglect of not putting a cover over the pit, you are going to be responsible for your neighbour's loss in that situation, and you're guilty because of what we would suppose would call neglect. Okay, got that? It makes sense. But now it then deals with another scenario, which is that of an unrestrained animal. So picking up in verse 35, if anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had a habit of going out and goring, yet the owner didn't keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. So the key thing here is in verse 5, if anyone's ox hurts another so that it dies, they shall then sell the fox and divide the money from it. Both the money of the live and the dead fox is divided. So that's straightforward, but if it had been known that the ox was intended to threaten people, or the bull as it's sometimes translated, and the owner had made the decision not to bother tying up, fencing it in, then he has to pay for the dead animal completely. So again, this is a situation where you are deemed responsible for your neighbour's loss of property. Only in this case it has to do with letting your animal loose when you should have restrained it or secured it. So if you think about this scenario, who owns this dangerous ox? Well, in this case, it's us. But in this case, you're the one who has to sell that animal, and the value of the dead animals now, in this case, isn't to be divided. Because it's your fault, you're going to lose the value of your ox and recompense for the one that was killed. And the reason why you are fully responsible is you neglected to secure it, and you must restore the damage that has been caused by that situation. You see, if you knew that this animal was aggressive, then you should have kept it tied up, and because you didn't do that, even here we go in the Mosaic law thousands of years ago, you shall pay. So you see, the penalty in this situation is greater than the penalty than just this situation happening with a random ox, which has never done it before. You have to restore the property that was lost, and you will pay. And of course that principle still applies today. If we think of the responsibilities of good dog ownership, or in terms of property ownership, it's our responsibility to keep a dog under control, particularly if it's aggressive, or if we've got a property, whether individually or corporately, like a church would own a property. If we neglect that property and someone is injured because of your lack of oversight, then legally still today you're liable, and that principle still applies. Got it? Okay, all good so far. Moving on. The next case of loss of property now has to do with stealing. This directly goes into the heart of the initial commandment, which was thou shalt not steal. That was the 8th commandment, recorded in chapter 20 verse 15. But beginning here in chapter 22, it will give us some specific cases about someone stealing something. Let's see, looking at verse 1, it says, whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So this is just a straightforward case of stealing. So the ox or the bull is gone, someone steals it and they get caught, and when they're caught you find out they've killed it and disposed of it. Then he has to restore 5 times back to you. And if it was a case of a stolen sheep, then he has to restore the sheep to the tune of 4 times. But why the difference? Why 5 for ox and 4 for sheep? Well, the answer, it seems to suggest, is that the ox is more valuable. And it's more valuable because it was part of the production process over and above just its value as a basic commodity in itself. In other words, it's just not just worth its value as meat. The fact that it would be used for ploughing meant it had a value over and above its set value. So the principle here is established, which remains to this day, that the more valuable something is, the greater the liability, and therefore the greater the penalty of restoration. And please note that there's a higher level of restoration required than the amount taken, because this was a immoral act of theft. Now, just before moving on, I think it's worth noting that there were other ancient codes at that time. In fact, the most ancient code, one we know of, is the Code of Hammurabi, which actually existed well before the Mosaic Law. And it's interesting to note that in that case, in this situation, if you stole something like that, the code declared that you would simply be put to death. So the Mosaic legislation is much fairer and has an element of recompense included in it. So, but again, the principle is established that the crime and the punishment should be commensurate. Commensurate to cover all losses and additional losses incurred, but not excessively so. So if all you did in the first case where you were responsible for the loss of an animal, then you simply needed to restore it and there was nothing over and above it. But with the theft of an animal, a higher recompense was required. And this is the very basis, the Mosaic sense of justice, which in a sense will become the basis of British justice, American justice, in fact most justice and legal systems worldwide. Okay, there's another case brought before us, another example. Verse 2, it says, if a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. Now this is where it can get a little tricky, so you'll need to bear with me. For the first one, it's clearly just a case of stealing. But the second one is what we would call burglary, or I believe the term in America is home invasion. And the difference is simply this. Stealing is just taking something from someone that is not yours, where burglary belongs breaking into someone's property. Now, this illustration or this case has to do with breaking into a house, and there seems to be two different considerations here. One involves breaking in the middle of the night. So in other words, it's talking about doing these events under cover of darkness, and the other is during the daylight. And it says if the thief is found breaking in at night and he's struck by the homeowner and he dies, then there's no guilt for his bloodshed. You see, in the middle of the night, if someone breaks into your house and you strike a burglar and they happen to die, that's usually not considered as murder. Now, I'm not sure if that's the law today in every part of the world. I know it is in some countries. But the principle is, the idea is that in the middle of the night, you won't actually know whether someone's come to steal or to kill you. So there is a gradient approach to this. It could even be what in some societies we today call justifiable homicide. The principle is, when you feel your life is threatened, you do have the right to defend yourself, if you have good reason to feel your life is threatened. So in this scenario, it's talking about someone breaking into the house at night and then they get killed. And it's saying that if the burglar dies, if you struck them or did something else and they died, then you're not necessarily guilty of murder, and you're not guilty of premeditated murder at the highest level. However, look at verse 3, which builds in some caveats. It says, if this happens during daytime and you kill the person, then you, this is the homeowner, are guilty of bloodshed. Now, of course, we're talking about a thief here, and in the case of someone who breaks in. So you shouldn't, if this happens in daylight, do something that would result to killing or seriously injuring. The principle being that he will, if he's caught, yes, he'll be liable for what he stole, and he will have to make full restitution, but that is not at the level of life for life. Adding also, interestingly, that if the offender doesn't have the money to pay, then the judges will be allowed to make him a slave working for you or for someone else until he pays back the original person whom he stole from for the goods at the agreed level. Continuing in verse 4, it says, if the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox, donkey or sheep, they may pay back double. So this is a really simple scenario where the thief has been caught red-handed. He's caught with the goods in his hand. Thereby, the person gets the goods back, but because he's caught red-handed, he has to restore double the value. So again, there's a liability over and above just the plain loss of property. So these first two groups of cases, if you like, in the first part they deal with neglect on the part of the owner or the person responsible that causes someone else to lose property above that or sustain a personal injury. But in the second case, this is the case of burglary and theft. But in each and every case, there always has to be restoration back to where it was and a monetary penalty. You have to pay back what was lost, and depending on the situation, a multiple of it. But there are two other situations to come now. Listen to this one in verse 5. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyards and lets them stray and graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. So this is apparently a case where there is a loss, and that loss, well, in this case it could be by animals straying onto other land, but as opposed to, I've read some people who'd say in this day and age would say it could apply to a situation where you let a fire get out of control and damage neighbours' property. But in this case, it's dealing with the basic issue. The example given is the loss of crop from the field or the vineyard. And in this case, the person who's responsible for the animals that have broken in and grazed on another's land must make restitution, but interestingly, he has to do it from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. So again, there is responsibility, liability, and restitution. And in this particular case, you are to give the best of yours. I suppose that's a way of ensuring that you at least restore the loss of the other, that it is at the very least like for like, if not better. And then verse 5 deals with the idea of fire. And it says that if a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns a neighbour's stock of grain or standing grain in the field, the one who starts the fire must make restitution. So again, a clear-cut case of accidental fire where the person has to be called to account and held responsible. You see, because the fire has spread to the crops of our innocent guy, then he not only has to be restored, but restitution has to be made. Okay, we've looked at neglect, we've looked at stealing, and we've looked at rights and responsibilities. And I think we need to recognize the one simple idea, the basic principle that is underlying all these cases is the fact that people have the right to own property. And if you cause someone else by whatever means to lose that property through accident or neglect or thought, then that property must be restored and that person must be recompensed. And that principle still applies today. That's why we have insurance for some things. It's really straightforward. If we're driving a car down the road and we run into, well, let's say someone's garden wall, then you as the driver of the car have to pay for the wall. Okay, that's the principle, but there's more, and it's going to get really interesting, because what's going to happen when someone puts their property into your custody and they ask you to take care of it? Now that happens to us in this day and age, doesn't it? Sometimes we go away on holiday and we give the keys to our house to somebody. Or sometimes you'll say, will you take care of my cat or dog or other family pet? So it's those sorts of situations that we're going to talk about here. So, even these old-fashioned examples, we still can find applications for them today. So the scripture is relevant. It's not mentioning looking after a cat or a dog here. It doesn't mention giving someone a key to your house, but the same principle clearly applies. So look at verse 7. It says, if anyone gives a neighbour silver or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbour's house, and the thief is caught, he must pay back double. So if someone's left something at your house and it's stolen, and a thief breaks into the house and steals it, it is then the thief that has to pay double, obviously. Well, we say obviously, but the principle's being established here. Notice the penalty is always greater than the crime when it comes down to a guilty party like this. So there's built into this legal system this proto-legal system, a sort of incentive right from the beginning that you shouldn't do this ever again. Because when you do this sort of thing and you get caught, it's going to cost you more. In this case, twice as much as if you didn't steal the thing in the first place. But as I said earlier, you need to bear in mind that the ancient codes of that time in this situation pretty much all demanded death for theft. So the Mosaic law is much more in line with our idea of justice today, in that you pay up and there is an element of penalty on top as a way of restoration, but it's made to the person who suffered the loss. All right, then that's the principle, and then he adds a variation and a complication in, if you like. But it says, so the stuff's been stolen while it's under your stewardship, but a thief is not found. Then it says the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. So there is an element of suspicion, or at least there needs to be a determination as to whether the person supposedly caring for the goods was actually this person responsible for the loss. So the example might be, in this day and age, you leave a dog at someone's house, and dogs can be worth a lot of money, and the dog is said to go missing. You say, well, either the dog escaped, well, then it would be your responsibility to secure them, or you're saying someone broke into the house and stole the dog, but they didn't catch the thief. So you can see this is a complication on this, a variation on it. Well, it tells us simply that if no evidence or thief is found, then the house owner, the person responsible, should be brought before the judges to make a determination as whether he was responsible in any way for the loss or perhaps the misappropriation of this animal or goods. In other words, there will be a judgment made on whether the homeowner, the person caring for the thing with responsibility for the thing, is in fact the guilty party. All right, verse 9. It says, in all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or a garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, this is mine. So there's a dispute here. It's saying both parties are to bring their cases before the judge, and the one whom the judges declares guilty must pay back double to the other. So in all of these situations, you're really going to have to tell it to the judges, they say, brought before the judges who will weigh the testimonies and the evidence. But the important point is, if it finds that one party is guilty, then the requirement will be that not only that person pays, but they pay double. Okay, let's continue. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbour for safekeeping, and it dies, or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord, that the neighbour, that's the person looking after this thing, did not lay hand on that other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if it turns out the animal was stolen from the neighbour, restitution must be made to the owner. If it is torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbour shall bring the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. So all right, it's all sort of common sense in our mind now. You've got to remember, this is the first time these principles have been laid down. So if we go back to our dog again that we've decided to look after for our friends, and that dog disappears and no one sees it, then we have to swear an oath before the Lord that we're not responsible. And if that's the case, then, and that's all that happened, we don't have to make restitution. Fair enough. The assumption is that we live in a society where telling the truth and the swearing of oaths is important, and that people fear the Lord, and you can agree on things like this by the taking of an oath, or even what we today maybe even say a handshake. We used to have that principle in this country for a lot of things, but sadly I feel in the last 40 years it's become a bit like ancient history, like what we're reading today. But if in fact that animal then says it was stolen for him, then the thief is the one who makes restitution to the owner. But if it turns out the animal's disappeared and then it was found to have been killed by wild animals, then you bring the carcass as evidence. And then there's no requirement to make good. So in other words, providing you can present evidence, then you're able to say, I was innocent, not me, and everything's fine. Well, not fine, but there's no legal restitution need to be made. And then finally, we'll close off with these two verses today. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbour and it's injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay him. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. So finally, it's about borrowing something. Now, in this case, of course, it's animals, because it's unlikely people would borrow anything else, really. And if it turns out the animal dies, and the owner was there when it died, and he borrowed it, then he's not responsible for that death. Clearly, there was something wrong with that animal, and because the owner was there when it happened, and it just died in front of him, it wasn't as a result of neglect, then there should be no restitution. And it also actually says because it was hired, in other words, they've rented it, that was included, the potential of the loss should have been included in the rental price, and that's the end of it. So we'll finish looking at the text there, because we've raced pretty much through it, and I suspect listening to it, I don't think there's many of us who could just stand up and repeat them all back. But let me just try and summarise very quickly what I've said and make the basic simple points that need to be made here. This is all important because it's dealing with the principle lays down on equity in terms of the loss of property. That's the one thread that runs through all of these things. There was losses by neglect, there was a loss by stealing, there was a loss by fire, and there was even losses when something was put in your custody for care, and situations where losses were experienced in all sorts of different ways. So the thread running through this is I am responsible for the loss in these cases unless it was something that happened that was beyond my control. And I think that sort of sums it up then, and it sums things up to this day. Now, we've raced through this passage pretty quickly. I'm probably a bit out of breath like me. And at the beginning, I asked you to pay attention and see if you thought there was something missing. Something in this legal system that we have today that isn't even mentioned here. I wondered if you figured it out today. If you tried all these situations and applied all these and dealt with all these people who were doing things that were morally wrong, breaking the law, theft, etc., would you think there's some aspect of our modern law that this passage doesn't even mention? Something that doesn't quite line up with our modern way of approaching these issues. I said at the beginning in this short little series that our legal system today in most countries is based on the Mosaic Law, but there's something glaringly missing out of what they did then compared to what we do today. So it speaks of theft, and it speaks of there always being a need for restoration, in the sense that we would say if there's a penalty, if there's a crime, someone breaks into your house, someone steals something, and they get caught, what happens today is they go to jail. That would usually be part of their punishment. But have you noticed it's not here? It's not in this situation at all. There's no jailing of people. There's no incarceration scheme here. What there is instead is always the principle of restitution. Restitution here means paying the fine to the victim, not the government, and not going to jail. Suppose we had a system that says if anyone is caught stealing, you have to pay back at least double, and in some cases maybe up to 5 times. Would that not be a more just system? Remember, there's nothing here, not one word in this whole passage about incarceration or jail. And if you look in the Bible, you will find no mention of jail. Not one single version of it in relation to the Mosaic Law ever demands jail or prison or incarceration in any way. There are, of course, tales and stories of people in the Bible being in jail. The first person to go to jail, in fact, was an innocent man named Joseph. And the Bible also talks about the prophets being thrown in jail, and Paul and Silas and other people go to jail. But jail is not seen as a positive thing. Jail is never recommended as a good idea for any of these contraventions of the law. Now, you may need to hang on to your hats a minute and try not to get too upset, but I'm going to say something very controversial, and that is theologically, I believe from a Christian point of view, you can say theologically, I'm opposed to jail. Now, I'm not saying I know how to institute the changes in our society without causing absolute chaos if we try to change things as they are now, but I do think from a biblical point of view you can make a case for not having jail. What you should have in place is reparations. And what they did in those days was to make people work and pay back whatever the multiple was required to make restitution, and that sometimes would include them, if they didn't have those financial resources to do that, for them to go into indentured service until the debt had been paid. Now, that's what they did there. I don't even know how we could apply that today from where we are at this point in time. I wouldn't even begin to politically try and recommend it or attempt it, but I do believe that the Bible shows that from God's point of view, he's not talking about incarceration, he's always talking about reparation. So I want to end by making one final other observation. I said that this passage makes the absolute assumption that there is such a thing as the right to own property. And it also assumes that you have responsibility for the property of other people or collective property of other people if it's been put in your care. And it is the one practical thing that I think we can apply out of this is that we should walk away from this knowing that we have responsibility to care for our own and other people's property. We shouldn't have a laissez-faire attitude about it. We shouldn't hire a car and think because it's a hire car, it doesn't matter how we treat it. It means because something like a building or something is owned by the community, by the local community, or by the wider government, that we shouldn't treat it with the same respect as we do our own. And that includes having respect for property when we borrow it, or when something has been put in our custody. There should be an element of recognizing we have a responsibility to look out for it, to not neglect it. The Bible teaches that we ought to respect all property, our own and other people's, and we're told that in these examples of God's, if you like, biblical grace laws. Because when you tie it into what it's being tied into here with the 10th commandment of thou shalt not steal, then the disrespect for property in a way is sort of behaving like a thief. And if you're a thief in any of these ways, then you, our sense, are disrespecting the Lord himself, who laid down the laws that thou shalt not steal. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Here we are again. We've been going through the book of Exodus together. We're beyond the halfway mark now, and we've come to this part of Exodus where God lists various precepts, commonly referred to in this day and age as the Mosaic Law. Now, some of these laws might strike us as being a bit out of date, particularly in the context that they're put in, yet at the same time, as I've already pointed out in this series, the fact that our whole judicial system is based upon these Judeo-Christian ethics. So in a sense, these moral laws being revealed here in the lessons are still valid because they're still the underlying basis on which Western civilization and most of the societies around the world still link to or base themselves upon. So although every law and subject discussed here might not apply to us, and we're not under it in that sense, but certainly the principles involved in underpinning these laws are still able to teach us some valuable moral lessons, providing we can understand the context that they're in and how to apply them in the context in which we might apply them today. When approaching these precepts, we remember we're here in Exodus 22, and it was only just back in Exodus chapter 20 where the commandments were given. And then in 21 verse 1, we have this overarching comment to tell us what's coming in the next 4 chapters, where it says, now these are the judgments. And that's the point at which these judgments start here. So as I said, it's going on for several chapters, giving us various applications of the commandments. In other words, how they were mediated and judged to be appropriate at that time. And the first of that group we looked at a couple of days ago dealt with damage to people, which is in a sense an extension of thou shalt not kill. The next section dealt with the destruction of property, and we looked in that in relation to the commandment thou shalt not steal. And in this session we're going to look at the third part of my 4-part series, looking at these precepts that follow on. and asking what we can learn from the Mosaic Law. And we're going in this third section is beginning in Exodus chapter 22, and it starts at verse 16. Usually my pattern is to read the whole passage, but you've noticed to this, because it's dealing with repeated short examples, I'm just going to read the passage as we go along in each section and what it deals with. And the first part of this passage is going to deal with the issue of premarital sex. Then it'll go on to talk about idolatry, and then it'll go on to deal with some social sins, and then we'll actually finally see it deal with spiritual sins. So let's start with these premarital sins, which is chapter 22, verses 16 and 17, where it says, "If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give him to her, he must pay the bride price as for virgins." So what it says here, it uses this term seduces, entices, and the Hebrew word literally means to persuade, to manipulate, using seduction. So this is not a rape. That's what we first of all need to clearly say. In this, there are two people, and they're not married, and they have sexual relationships. And the whole point being made here that we need to take account of is this is a situation where they're not married. In a sense, this is an extension, a wider scoping, a wider application of the seventh commandment, which just said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So in other words, as I mentioned, the commandments itself give the broad framework, and then we get the judgments discussed in these chapters 21 to 24, and they do it through the use of case studies and examples, specific cases where it says this is how the application of this commandment should be applied in these cases. And it actually goes on beyond adultery. It will also deal with general premarital sex, as we'll see in a minute. But at any rate, in this case, it's about a couple, a man and a woman, not married. She's not what we would call engaged or betrothed, and they have sex. And according to this part of the verse, the result is that he has to pay the bride price for her to be his wife. In other words, that's the dowry, which they did in those days. If you were going to marry a young woman, a man had to pay her father the bride price, and that was a pretty steep payment, by the way. So if he has relationships with a girl, he then has to pay the dowry and marry her. But then verse 17 said, if the father doesn't like this idea, in other words, if the father utterly refuses to give her to him, the man who's done the seducing still has to pay the money according to the bride price of a virgin. So the father says, as an example, no, you can't have her. The man who slept with her still has to pay the dowry. And as I mentioned, that's a substantial amount of money. And that's probably because in that day, if this girl was no longer a virgin, the possibilities of her now being married were greatly reduced. So the father's given the dowry even if he does not allow her to marry him. So you can see, if nothing else, this would stand as a pretty strong discouragement in the use of seduction or the temptation to act on the temptation of premarital sex, particularly misusing it as a way of manipulation, because in the end you might end up paying for something that you're not actually going to get access to in the end. Now, like I said, in this day and age we're not under those ancient laws in this way, so this doesn't apply directly to us today, other than giving us a sort of general moral climate. It did apply in this way to the ancient Israelites to whom it was given and received. And so let's just talk about that for a second. So as I mentioned, this is not a case of rape. It's a case of persuasion. There are other passages in the Pentateuch and in the Mosaic Law that indicate that premarital sex is indeed sinful. Passages that talk about it are Deuteronomy 22, verses 13 to 29. But it is worth thinking about how, if at all, this principle might apply today. I wonder if you'd say if two single people had premarital sex, that means they should get married. I mean, isn't that what verse 16 says? So maybe is that a good idea? Is that something we should be recommending today? Well, I have to say my answer to that will be a resounding no. Or anyway, a not necessarily, at least. And I would say that based first of all, on this actual verse. Because what we see here is that even the Mosaic law recognized that it didn't have to happen. You didn't have to go through following this situation and get married, even for those living at that time. And the other thing I would say is that we're not under the Mosaic law, that it may not be a good idea for these two people to get married. Suppose one of them is a Christian and the other is not. Then in that case, the New Testament scripture would tend to supersede the advice and say it is not recommended that you marry someone who doesn't share the same faith as you. So I think it's rather interesting that this discusses premarital sex, and yes, it talks about marriage, but it doesn't demand that the people should get married after it. In fact, it includes a caveat by which it might be avoided. So just because they had premarital sex did not mean ipso facto in that day and age that they should get married. So certainly it should be even less considered as a principle to apply it today. All right, that's the first law in this section. The first law in this third section of what I'm calling case law. And now we look at the next one. It begins in verses 18 down to 20. And this will deal with the issue of idolatry. These cases are related to the first commandment, I believe, which says, you shall have no other gods before me. So this is an expansion and an application of that commandment. So let's look at these three verses in one go. At first appearance, they may not seem connected, but as I hope I shall demonstrate, they are, in fact, indeed are connected. It says, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death, and whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. So how is this all related to idolatry? Well, the first question you need to ask is, what is sorcery? And of course, it's another term for witchcraft. It's nothing more than just the claim to have supernatural powers and to use them by means of spells, magic, or knowledge and revelations that are said to come from spirits, evil spirits. One author I read said about this, it's the foretelling of the future or controlling the future or others by demonic power. And I do think that there are modern parallels to this. It might even just be the fortune teller who lives down the street from you. Here in this part of the UK where I live, there's a very large holiday resort. And in that holiday resort, very many tarot readers and psychics ply their trades with booths along the seafront and shows in the seaside theatres. So I guess if I wanted to, I could go down that promenade and I could get my fortune told. But verse 18 says, in this situation, in this culture, it says you shall not permit such a person to live. So it's recommending capital punishment. Now, without discussing the merits or otherwise of capital punishment, I think that must at least raise the question as why this is seen as such a serious sin by God. And ultimately, it's because people are choosing to be looking to the occult for direction and guidance on how to live their lives, instead of going to the Lord. You see, by going to a witch, you're putting the sorceress in the place of God. And God takes that very seriously. This type of so-called magic constituted an attempt to override God's will and God's position. And that's the point here. And because this has been practiced in the place of God among the people of God, he considers it a very serious sin. All right, I said all three verses were talking about idolatry, but you'll notice sandwiched between them is this unusual verse about bestiality. Now, some think this is sort of slipped in and not relevant, but this is actually referring to idolatry as well. So let me explain why. The verse actually said, whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. So why is that included with idolatry? It doesn't on the surface sound like it, granted, but here's why and what's going on. You see, in the ancient world of that time, in that region, among the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians, they attributed their gods to this practice. They practiced bestiality in the worship of their gods. So at this time, this was part of their worship system. And it was a worship system in the Canaanite people and region, which is where the Israelites are heading to. So whereas some of the law codes did indeed impose death penalties for having sex with certain animals, you need to understand it was actively encouraged with others. And the Mosaic law comes along here and prohibits this practice firmly and completely. So if you just read the passage and you thought that sorcery and bestiality and idolatry are all separate topics, well, the very fact that they're putting them together here in these 3 verses tells us that they're interconnected, and they really are in the context into which these precepts were written in the society at that time. Verse 20 explicitly mentions idolatry itself. He says, "He who sacrifices to any god except the Lord shall be utterly destroyed." So in all these 3 cases, in these 3 verses, the punishment and the penalty was ultimately death, capital punishment. You're putting something in place of the Lord, and you're replacing it with something occult and evil, therefore the penalty is death. Now, so far we've looked at 2 topics: idolatry, which determines what's right and wrong, and premarital sex. And it would appear that the laws tend to be very rigid in the response to these things. But the next set I'm calling dealing with social or the societal issues, because it has to do with people's relationship with other people. And this section begins in verse 21 and goes down to verse 27. So let's see what it says. It initially says, "You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt yourself." Now this is a wholly different thing that stands apart, and maybe we'd struggle to directly apply it to any of the 10 commandments, but it's right in the middle here, and it's talking about our relationship to other people, and it starts with our relationship towards strangers. It says you shouldn't mistreat or oppress a stranger. Now the word translated mistreat means actually to treat violently, or to treat them in a way that's unjust or wrong, that causes oppression. But I want you to understand that it could also mean something as simple as not doing the right thing for a stranger, being prejudiced against them. The word oppress that's used here actually means to squeeze, to put pressure on them. So it means that you're doing something to the point where by putting pressure on it, means that you're oppressing that person. So the commandment is over and above the simple request to refrain from doing evil, but in effect it will tell us in the following verses that we are commanded to do good. Now, we know that that's said anywhere else in many other passages in the Bible. In fact, it's coming back in a few verses in this chapter, but you can't escape the fact that there's a whole slew of New Testament verses which say something very like this. But notice why he tells us we shouldn't do this. He adds the interesting phrase, "You should not mistreat a stranger because you yourself were once a stranger in Egypt." You should not mistreat someone or oppress someone because you yourself were once oppressed in Egypt. So the point is this, and we need to understand this. Most of the laws here just say, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And here he comes and he says, yeah, don't do this. But this one, he comes and he gives us a reason. And he says, don't do this thing because you should be able to understand these people because you were once in that same situation. So because you should understand this, this is why you shouldn't do it. And I think that's rather interesting. All right, so he deals with strangers. But what about the other social relationships? He's now going to deal with widows and orphans. And he says in verse 22, very simply, do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. You're not to mistreat any widows that are in the community. You shouldn't take advantage of people who happen not to have fathers or husbands, because they're already in a situation where they're vulnerable and without protection. In this society, the man pretty much protected the woman. A husband would protect the wife, the father would protect the children. So if there were widows or orphan children without fathers in the community, this is clearly instructing that they should not be taken advantage of or mistreated in any way, for the very fact, because it acknowledges that they're vulnerable. Now, if you go through the Mosaic law, you'll discover that there are many occurrences of this idea of widows needed to be protected, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, where it will be discussed in chapters 14, 16, 24, and 26. Now, I don't expect you to remember all of them. I'm just saying that there's a long list because I want to impress on you the idea, the concept is that this is mentioned over and over again in the Mosaic Law, so it must be important. Then he says this in verse 23, if you do, in other words, if you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. Man, my anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with sword, and your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. So this is the fascinating verse, one of these core principles again. The thing that strikes me here is God says, I'm going to do this. And he says, if you're going to mess with someone and they're widow or fatherless, then believe me, I'm going to come and deal with it. And God is saying here that again, he will base with it on the basis of strict judgment like for like. So potentially the situation these people find themselves in, you could find your own family experiencing the same thing. All right, we've talked about relationships with one another, with strangers, with widows, with the fatherless. The next category under the social side goes on to the issue of dealing with the lending of money. Verse 25 says, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal and charge no interest. Now we've looked at your relationships to people, strangers, widows, etc. And now we're looking at our relationships with the poor and needy. And the issue in this case is the issue of lending money. But it's clearly dealing with just the lending of money to this class of people called the poor. And what it says here is that if that person is among my people, in this case meaning the Jews, and you loan the person money, you shall not charge interest. Now the Jews could and were allowed to charge interest to the Gentiles, but it was frowned upon among their own people, but particularly when it came to lending money to people because they were poor or in need. So interest shouldn't be charged, so the needy should not be taken advantage of. Now there's another category within this, a subcategory if you like, and that's to do with lending money again, but it's a slightly different issue because it's telling you how to deal with any pledge that's offered. It says if you take your neighbour's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because the cloak is the only covering your neighbour has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear them, for I am compassionate. So we can assume again, we're talking particularly, specifically about poor people here, and the fact that it's reasonable to take a security deposit, but in this point it says if it was a garment, you should return it to that person before nightfall, which seems to indicate that because of their poor economic state, that they needed the garment to keep them warm at night, and it's the only one they would have. So God's saying here, you must give it back to them so that they can be warm at night. So before the next day and it gets cold at night, you have to give back the security deposit. Now, he's said again in this passage, if my people cry to me, I'll hear them and I'll come down and deal with the situation. Now, that was said with the widows and orphans, remember? But now he's saying it in response to the poor. If a poor person is deprived to the point where they're not even warm at night because of you, and they call out to me in their struggling, you need to be aware I'm going to hear what they've said. And he doesn't just say he's going to hear what he says he's going to act on it. But in this case, he doesn't specify how, but he says, be sure I'm going to act on the situation, and you better be dealing with it justly. Another point is he not only explains how he's going to deal with it, he explains why, his motivation, if you like, and he says he will do these things because I am gracious. So essentially he implies that you should be gracious too. If you think about it, what he's saying, I am gracious and I'm going to take care of it. Implied within the passage is you should be doing this in the appropriate way. You should be taking care of it. But if you don't, be sure that I will. So we should be gracious. And here are two reasons why we should stick to these instructions. First of all, it says to relate to them. He says, don't you realize you've experienced similar situations? And because by being gracious, like I am gracious, you will see and experience the benefits of being gracious. Now, when I studied the book of Genesis a few months back, I shared a Jewish legend with you about Abraham that I think illustrates this point very well. I'll briefly do so again. According to this old Talmudic legend, one evening Abraham noticed an old man approaching his tent, a man who was tired from his journey. Following the tradition of that time, the custom, Abraham hurriedly welcomed him in and washed his feet and offered him food and drink. The old man started eating without praying or giving thanks to God. This surprised Abraham, and he asked the man, "Don't you worship God?" And the old man responded, "I worship only fire and no other God." This angered Abraham so much that he forcibly expelled the old man out from his tent and into the cold night. But after the old man left, the story says that God asked Abraham, "Where is that old man?" And Abraham replied, "I forced him out because he didn't worship you." And God answered and said to Abraham, "I tolerated this man for 80 years. Despite his ongoing disrespect for me, couldn't you have endured him for just one night?" You see, this legend, obviously created by the rabbis as a story, was done to convey the point that we're seeing here in Exodus, that because God is gracious and God is patient, that we should emulate his grace in our expressions of how we deal with other people. Now let's move on to the next section, which explores what I'm calling spiritual sins. So these previous sections we've discussed premarital sex, idolatry, and social sins, but these spiritual sins refer to our own personal direct relationship with the Lord. In verse 28 it states, "Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people." Now this word blaspheme is a rather narrow translation. The word actually means to revile or to belittle or to disregard. The instruction is clear. It says, don't disrespect or curse the Lord or the ruler who has authority over you. It's saying here, it's implying that the ruler is likely to be God's representative, highlighting the importance of this relationship and our relationship with the authority of the society in which we live. And the law overarchingly emphasizes the need for respect, because otherwise, by disrespecting our rulers, we're disrespecting the idea and general and principle of authority. Unfortunately, our societies have reached a particular low in this regard. Whether or not you agree with the political leaders of the land that you have, we have, I would say, traditionally in the past respected the leaders of our country. So you may feel that the disrespect for leaders that you have or see around you is because of that particular leaders. I would say the actual motivation for it, where it's really coming from here, is what's being pointed out here, which is actually because we live in a climate, a society, where there is now a total absence of the fear of God. And that has led to a decline in respect to all authority. So be aware, friends, this extends way beyond just our political opinions or disrespect of our political leaders. It has poisoned our classrooms, it has poisoned our attitudes to the police and to local government and every tier of government and those who are in public service for us, even to the point of our health service. Respect is diminishing everywhere, and I think it simply reflects the diminishing reverence for God. Many refer to the era we live in, particularly in the UK and Europe, as post-Christian, where Christianity no longer holds the influence that it once did. And I think that that is true. And this lack of respect testifies to that. The law here indicates that we should revere God and respect the leaders of the world that God has put or allowed to reign over us. And these verses encapsulate the message. And then, getting to the end of this section now, the subsequent verses deal with sacrifice. And 29 says, "Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give the firstborn of your sons." So, quick reminder, according to the Mosaic law, farmers were required to give the first produce of their harvest to the Lord. However, they did have the option to redeem it by paying a price instead. But the purpose in both of these things was to teach about God's primacy, the fact that God must come first. Similarly, the firstborn son was to be dedicated to the Lord, but that also could be redeemed with an exchange for money. But this dedication event occurred when the son was 8 days old, and that's mentioned elsewhere in a number of occasions in the Old Testament and beyond. And then verse 30 says, do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but then give them to me on the 8th day. So the firstborn sons, the firstborn produce, and now we see the firstborn animals, they're all to be consecrated, which means set apart, dedicated to the Lord. The sons were dedicated on the 8th day, and the animals too, they'd stay with their mothers for 7 days, and then they'd be offered to the Lord on the 8th day. And then moving on to the final verse 31, it states, you are to be my holy people, so do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts or thrown to dogs. So this closing verse this closing section, in fact, concerns our relationship with the Lord. And then here, right at the end, it instructs us simply not to eat meat torn by animals and found in the field, but to discard it so that it may only be used for the dogs. Now, this law is a bit intriguing to me, because what it's saying, if you find an animal, and one assumes it would be something like a sheep or something like that, and it was killed by another creature, you were forbidden from eating the leftovers, the entrails. Consuming an animal torn in the field was deemed unsuitable. Now, we would know today, of course, that would carry diseases, and the flesh would certainly not have properly been drained of blood as required by the Mosaic law. So this precept at one and the same time protects the people physically, but also attempts to protect them spiritually. The law underscores that as a holy people devoted to God, they are to do in the offering and the preparation of their food, that they are to do it in a way that is devoted to God. So to conclude this entire section, it's all about emphasizing our relationships with one another and with the Lord, and how believers are to be set apart, holy it's called, even to the point of not killing animals that beasts have killed, thereby demonstrating our dedication to do things according to God's instructions and in certain ways, and by doing that they will serve as protected measures for his people. Okay, that's the text. How are we doing? In one sense, this passage is very simple. Various Mosaic laws pertaining to our social and spiritual relationships, and teach us how to do what is right, and telling us that if we do that, we'll be blessed. But the important thing not to miss is the reason given for doing this, and the Lord allowing and giving us these precepts, is because it tells us he's gracious. So the big thing I want you to walk away from this passage, because we'll always struggle with the application and drawing the line in the sand of what represents then and now, but the one thing that you can take from this passage without any problem at all is know that the motivation for doing these things and for God doing these things with us is because of his desire to be kind to us, to be gracious to us. Now, those of you who have heard me teach for years will know that what I frequently say, the sum of the Bible, the Old Testament there, is to say God is holy, and clustered around that are concepts relating to righteousness and justice. And when the New Testament arrives, core message becomes God is love, and clustered around that love we are given concepts of grace and mercy and kindness. In other words, the essence of what God is trying to produce in us. The New Testament says Jesus was full of grace and truth, but that, believe me, friends, is embedded even in this Mosaic law. So you can come to this passage in one sense, it says you need to do this to do what is right, but in the other sense you can see right in the middle of it, there is the motivation for doing right, and that is in order to be kind, to be compassionate, to be gracious with people. And if you do those things habitually, then you will be conformed to the likeness of Christ, because he is the one who will ultimately be revealed as the perfect representative, as the one, as the New Testament describes, who was full of grace and truth. But the tough part in all this, particularly when reading it in the Old Testament events, is to be gracious, and you be gracious by practicing righteousness. But in order to do that, you have to have heavenly wisdom. Because often it's really difficult to interpret what is the right, what is the loving, what is the gracious thing to do. It takes wisdom to know when and how and in what way to pull that difficult thing off in different situations. The great virtues of the Bible are revealed as righteousness, graciousness, wisdom and love. But the great message gleaned from this passage, even in these, what might seem on the surface, archaic laws, is that we do these things, we try to do these things because he was gracious. He was gracious first. And because he was gracious to us, we too should be gracious. And we should also, and we can also learn from this, the second reason we should do this is because you yourself were once in Egypt, so to speak. You've got to do this because you've been there. You've been there, and the Lord was gracious to you when you did not know or even care about him. So you've just got to look at yourself and have the spiritual sense to see and recognize who you are and what you are. And recognize that God has revealed himself to you and revealed how you should behave in the complex myriad of situations we will face in the societies in which we live under the underlying principle of graciousness and love. And I'd like to add a final thing, and it was there in the middle of this passage. He talks about the kind of people you ought to be gracious to. He talked about being gracious to the oppressed, to the widows. He talked about the fatherless, the vulnerable people, the poor people, the people who might be cold at night. So I believe embedded in this passage is the fact, if you really want to do this, if you really, really want to live this way, you've got to have a proper view of other people. You've got to see their needs rather than their feelings. And you've got to see them as God sees them, as people who are deserving of his grace. So if you realize truly that the Lord is gracious, you will do what he says and be gracious too. If you realize that you yourself have been there, and but for the grace of God you might be there again one day, then you will see the need of the people rather than the position of the people, and you will be inspired and prompted to do this. And in this passage, I think, challenging though it is, we can ultimately be reminded that if we choose to see the people around us in this way, what we have revealed to us is the moral fabric of our society and how it depends on our relationship with God, but also, friends, with one another. Okay, today we are considering together the 23rd chapter of the book of Exodus. Now, this is a long chapter, so I'm going to race through the actual text verse by verse pretty quickly. Initially, just hopefully, as I go, explaining the basis of what I believe is being taught and giving a commentary, if you like, as I run through it. And then I'll come back at the end as my normal pattern to consider what it maybe means for us today, or more importantly, how it can be applied. So today we start focusing on the fourth part of this section, which is covered from Exodus 21 through to what will be the beginning of chapter 24. And this is the fourth part in our study of this extension on the commandments. And today I believe the chapter can be roughly divided into three parts. And we'll look at each of these three parts and see if there are any valuable spiritual lessons that they can give us. So the first part we're going to look at today is chapter 23, verses 1 to 9, which deals with the application of legal justice. So verse 1 states this as an overarching principle. 23 verse 1, you shall not circulate a false report or be an unrighteous witness. So this is straight away emphasizing the need for impartial justice, not just in life, but particularly in relation to court cases, to the arbitration of disputes. And in it, the Israelites are told here that in no way they should be responsible personally or when being involved as a witness in a dispute in any way be responsible for the spreading of any falsehoods or conspiring in any way with the wicked to defend what are perceived as guilty people. It's really laying down the principle that impartiality is crucial in all legal matters, and of course that would remain a core principle of all legal systems around the world to this day. It unpacks it a bit more for us in the next couple of verses where it says, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. when you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. So these verses are warning us against the dangers of what I would suppose today the term we'd use would be like groupthink, and the importance of practicing impartial judgment in all situations, reinforcing the call for impartiality by instructing us not to be biased, but this time mentioning that the bias shouldn't either be against the poor man in any disputes. In other words, social status should not influence the outcome of a legal case in any way. It now then gets down to a couple of the practical scenarios of that day. So let's look at this first one. It says, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone else who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. Do not deny justice to the poor people in their lawsuits. So there's two things going on here at once in these verses. First of all, it extends a call for us to show kindness in all situations, even to our enemies, and even dealing in the most ordinary of everyday practical situations, showing kindness and fairness. So it actually uses the example that even if you see one of your enemy's animals in distress, you should in fact help. Now these verses remind us of how important it is to always show compassion over any animosity they might have, even in these seemingly unimportant everyday interactions, leading right up to even if we're in the middle of a legal disagreement with them. So again, this is creating a whole social system and legal system that ultimately everybody has to stand before it, and nothing should be done that in any way would hinder anyone's access to fair treatment in legal matters. The modern application of this principle extends to our own legal systems this day, in that it prioritizes fairness and compassion for all individuals, regardless of their circumstances. Now today, sadly, we see this as beginning to be overlooked again in sections of the law and in our societies, but Exodus here provides a valuable template on which all the lessons of the land and on legal justice might be based. Verse 7 to 9 tells us this: have nothing to do with false charges, and do not put an innocent or an honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be a foreigner, because you were once foreigners in Egypt. So I know I'm racing through these, but there's a lot of text to get through today. But very quickly, these couple of verses warn against all false matters. Anything that would kill the right to justice, promoting righteousness, and emphasizing the importance of always giving truthful testimony, particularly in the courts. Reminding the listener that, of course, in this situation, a false testimony could lead to the death of an innocent person. It also highlights the important prohibition of never accepting bribes, particularly in legal matters. As it's described here, it distorts judgment and it blinds discernment. Now this, of course, was a big issue in the ancient Near East, but rest assured it still remains a problem today in many parts of the world. And then it closes in verse 9 by outlawing the oppression of strangers, reminding the Israelites that this is something that they should not do, and they should particularly understand why they should not do it by stating how they themselves had experienced persecution in Egypt and know what it was like to be a foreigner in a strange oppressive land. So the overarching message of this opening section is to tell them, the children of Israel, to ultimately create a society which was fair and just, and to practice just and impartial justice in all the legal situations and conflict resolutions between people that were being arbitrated. It had to be the same system, whether dealing with the rich, the poor, or even enemies alongside friends. Everyone should be treated fairly. Okay, the next section, picking up in verse 10, moves to religious observances. Now, not all of this is going to apply to us, I think I need to say as a caveat, but there are some interesting applications we'll discover along the way, and this is going to take us through chapter 3, verse 10, all the way down to verse 19. So we'll quickly begin to run through the text together and see what we can pull out of it. So we begin at verse 10, and it says this: "For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops." Verse 11, "But during the 7th year let the land lie unploughed and unused. Then the poor among the people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." So this is the launching of what was called the sabbatical year, something that would occur every 7 years, meaning that in that 7th year they wouldn't work the land, and that would allow a space which would let the poor gather anything that naturally appeared on it, and also give some of the wild animals an opportunity to graze and eat on it. But the purpose of creating this sabbatical year was to remind Israel that it was God's land, and God owned the land, and that they were only stewards of it, and even if they left it, God would provide for them, that they could have confidence that during that time it would be restored to them to full use again. The next commandment follows is about the Sabbath day, verse 12, and it says, 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living amongst you may also be refreshed. So this, of course, is an extension of the commandment given earlier about remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, setting it apart. Now, in truth, the Jewish teachers of this time struggled to define what exactly rest and what exactly work meant. However, what is very clear in this is we can see the reason of the rest is revealed. It's not just like the commandment given. The motivation and the reason that God gave this command is revealed here, and that is ultimately to refresh people, to refresh the land, and even to refresh servants and strangers who were in the land. The text continues, "Be careful to do everything I've said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods, and do not let them be heard on your lips." So verse 13 now warns against even the mentioning of other gods' names, as it may tempt one to follow them. That's the principle here. The exception is the use of the gods' names can be used by prophets when verbally condemning the idolatry of false gods. Okay, now starting in verse 14, we're going to be introduced to the observance of some feasts, these 3 annual festivals that are introduced here. So reading for you from 14 to 19, it says this: 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me, to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. Eat bread made without yeast as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in the field, and celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year all the men who appear before me, the sovereign Lord. Do not offer the blood of sacrifices to me along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until the morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. And then this little statement at the end, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So, Israel here, well, there are 3 mentioned here. There are others, but 3 festivals are mentioned here. 3 feasts that are given with the purpose of reminding people of the provision of God. The Feast of Unleavened Bread here would involve the eating of unleavened bread for 7 days after the Passover celebration, symbolizing the purging of sin, the purging of malice and wickedness and anything that would puff up and cause pride among the people. The Feast of Harvest is also given, whereby the first fruits of the Lord are to be celebrated and offered to the Lord 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then finally the Feast of Ingathering, which would become known as Tabernacles, would also be instituted and would occur every autumn, symbolizing Israel's secure dwelling in the land. At all these events, males were required to appear before the Lord for these feasts. Sometimes women and children would be allowed to voluntarily participate, but it was a requirement on adult males, and sacrifices should be offered with leavened bread and the first fruits that should be brought from the land that should be brought into the house of the Lord. This prohibition against the boiling of a young goat in its mother's milk, it seems, was given to discourage participation in a particular pagan practice that was rampant at that time in that region. So what it's doing is it's separating these festivals from the local pagan events and setting up an alignment, if you want, and placing everything within the context of a religious observant, separate from what was going on in the land, but unique and particular to that which had been revealed and experienced by the people of God, the children of Israel. Ancient Israel were to follow these various religious practices and observing them, but also observing this sabbatical year on the 7th year in order to get the land to rest. But there's also contained within it this call, this important requirement that they should avoid idolatry in every way, at every way possible, even to the point of not mentioning idols' names. You see, these celebratory feasts, they're sacred occasions. Now, similarly, as Christians in our faith, we have similar spiritual holidays where we celebrate particular times in the Christian calendar, times like Christmas and Easter, where we celebrate the birth and, of course, the death, the resurrection of Christ. Now, ancient Israel has these three initial feasts and celebrations given here, but there are more mentioned as we progress through the Old Testament story, and we'll deal with those as they come. But the three that are initiated here all symbolize particular things. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the one that occurs after Passover, where the bread's not consumed for 7 days. It memorializes and symbolizes the events around this hasty exodus from Egypt, but the need, having been redeemed, to continually rid oneself of sin, of malice, of wickedness. And it was leaven and the purging of the leaven that represented the sin that needed purging. The second feast, known as the Feast of Harvest, involved offering the first fruits to the Lord. It took place in the spring, marking the beginning of the wheat harvest and occurring 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then the Feast of Ingathering, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, that would be observed in the early autumn, probably late September, early October. And indeed, some Jewish and Messianic congregations to this day still construct small booths during this time, but also recognizing the transient quality of the world in which we live by building this temporary place in which they live and worship for a season. You see, this text here is saying that all males should appear before the Lord, and it sets this pattern, doesn't it, whereby people are constantly reminded to follow these patterns that would remind and suggest and link back to the sacrifices of the Passover feast, and also things like the first fruits coming out of the land, celebrating that and how the Lord kept people like that, all at the same time framing it within this constant warnings about separating themselves from idolatry and not participating in the local pagan practices. And there is much that we can still learn from that today. Okay, we've looked at the two sections so far. To remind you, the first section we looked at was verses 9 to 16, which basically says, don't practice impartial judgments, build a just society. And the second section, verses 17 to 19, has been saying in essence, remember to regularly make sacrifices to the Lord, to offer the first fruits of everything in your life, and also to rest on the Sabbath, to build patterns into your life where you allow everyone in the land and everything in the land to experience restoration. But there's one more section, and I'm going to call it the section that deals with the spiritual conquest. So we've looked at legal judgment and we've looked at religious observances, but this seems to go beyond all that, and it will talk about the spiritual aspect of this and how we might spiritually conquest and, in a sense, claim the land, if you wish. Okay, so let's look at verse 20, and it tells us this: "See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared." Now, if you look closely in your Bibles, you should take note of whether the word angel is spelled with a lowercase or an uppercase a, because that's always relevant. And in this case, you will see that it's an uppercase a, so this is no ordinary angel. Furthermore, the use of the word behold or see in this verse draws attention to the fact that the text is telling us that something special is on here. So what Bible experts pull together in this is that this is implying that the angel being sent is most likely the Lord himself, also described sometimes in the text in some translations as the angel of the Lord appearing. So what this means when you see it in the Old Testament is that this is in fact an appearance of Jesus in the form of an angel, as I say, sometimes referred to as the angel of the Lord. So it's referencing a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, before he took on physical form, so prior to his incarnation in the New Testament, he occasionally appears as the angel of the Lord, and that is very likely what is going on here. But the message is that this angel of the Lord, who is the Lord himself, is that he will be present to guide and lead the Israelites into the land that God has prepared for them. And this signifies a spiritual conquest that is coming as they enter the land. It continues, "Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him." Now, beware of him, he says. Now, if you've got a decent translation of the Bible, you'll notice the capital H is there for him, and obey his voice. Again, capital H. Do not provoke him, capital H, for he, capital H, will not pardon your transgressions. The capitalization of the term him throughout this phrase indicates again that this is referring to the angel of the Lord, who is Christ himself. Next, verse 22 states, "But if you indeed obey his voice, and you do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies, and an adversary to your adversaries." So this connects back to verse 20, where God promised, of course, to protect the people and lead the Israelites into the land he has prepared for them. The text continues, "For my angel," capital A, "will go before you and bring you to the land of the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. And I will take sickness away from the midst of you, and no one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in the land. I will fulfill the numbers of your days." Now let's pull that all together. The Israelites here are being instructed to destroy the idols and the sacred images of the Canaanites that would have been all around them. And there is reference here to the fact that some of these idols resembled male fertility symbols and were made of stones. God emphasizes that you should not even look to these pagan gods in any way, for the fertility of the land would be all around them, and instead they should trust in him to allow that to come to pass in that way. So this is much wider than just merely a fertility issue in terms of the land or even in terms of the people. It's primarily about allowing God to bless the people spiritually and to grow spiritually by the following of his will and the turning away from false gods. Moving on in verse 27, it then says, "I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their back on you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivite and the Canaanite and the Hittite from before you. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. But little by little I will drive them out before you, until you have increased and you can inherit the land. And I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea, Philistia, and from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants out of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. So essentially here, God is saying, look, I'm going to deal with all your enemies, all the things that you might face in the future. And in the verse here, it mentions that he's sending hornets before them to drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites. Now, it is fair to say that there are no specific references elsewhere in any of the text or referring back in the history of Israel to talk about God actually using physical hornets to drive out the Canaanites. Therefore, it is entirely possible that this may just be the use of figurative language symbolizing God's going before them and his deliverance from their enemies by driving the people out before him. But the point is, God informs them that it will be he who will eliminate all the enemies in the land, and it will be done in the main in the first year. But he will not do it all just in the first year, because if that was the case, if the land was suddenly left desolate, then the land might become unfruitful and even get overrun by wild animals. So what he's saying is this conquest, this taking of the land, this spiritual subjugation of the land is going to take, in fact, longer than a year. And it will take 7 years for Joshua, when he finally enters the land, until he fully conquers it. And even then, it states, not all the enemies were completely eradicated in that case. But by granting that the taking of the land would be gradual rather than all at once, we see in this verse that they will have time to settle, develop, cultivate the land as they go, thus thereby preventing it from becoming desolate or even falling back into enemy hands again. The purpose is very clearly revealed here. God will accomplish this, but he's going to accomplish this conquest gradually. As someone has aptly said, little by little does the work of the Lord. And that work, indeed, I believe, is the work of the Lord in terms of our soul and her own lives as well. Little by little is the conquest of the Lord. Little by little is the unfolding purpose of redemption in our life. But they will indeed happen, and God will indeed conquer the land. It's worth noting that this was never actually fully accomplished up until the time of Solomon, when they finally completely controlled pretty much all of the territory. But even then, some would argue it was never completely under Israel's control. But the important thing here is to say that God, in this process, at his pace, says he will deliver, not you shall, but I shall. The Lord is emphasizing that it is always he who will bring these things about. And furthermore, we see the entire reference to the taking of the land and the giving of it as an inheritance is always and as always remains conditional upon their obedience. He refers to it as their inheritance, but in order to gain the inheritance, they must obey him. Then there's a warning. It says, you shall make no covenant with them, nor worship their gods. They must avoid any association with the pagan gods that are already in that land. And then finally in verse 33 it says, they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve other gods, I will surely be a snare to you. So the Israelites are not allowed to worship the gods of the land that they're about to inhabit. They're not even to gaze upon them or mention them by name, because that is likely to lead them to sin, or even lead them to a point where they might start worshipping them in the land. And this is something that God clearly could not sanction and would not allow to happen. Okay, that's us through the text. I know we've rushed through it. It's a lot of material to get through, and I still wanted it to be pretty much a standard length episode. What I've tried to do is pull out each of the main points I think that are drawn out of this section. But I think the overall message here of all of this is be obedient and you will be blessed. And included in that, God is saying, I don't want you to worship these false idols. I will see to it that you are blessed, including your children, including having many children, claiming and taking over the land physically and spiritually, and living peacefully and abundantly in that new place. So that's the big picture here. Okay, so let me sum up and I'll try and make a couple of observations. The various provisions of the Mosaic Law are given here, and they're given in this chapter to cover three main issues. They're given to create a society in which impartial judgment and fairness is always practiced, also ways in which people may remember and offer sacrifices to the Lord, and ways in which they may conquer the land, both physically and in terms of spiritually in our lives, take control of the spiritual direction of our lives, ultimately by obeying him. And I think that, in a sense, summarizes the practical application of this whole chapter. We are to practice impartial judgment in everything we do, fairness to all people, friend or foe, and we are to sacrifice to the Lord, in other words, set apart for him, the first and the best of everything that comes, to acknowledge him and his part in it. We are also to sacrifice in the sense we are to surrender something of today to allow for the greater good in the future and the conquering of the land. And ultimately we are to bless him, and that by doing these things he will indeed truly bless us. So if you notice, the three things here include other people. They all include our relationships with other people, practicing impartial judgment, giving and sacrificing to the Lord, and being obedient. By doing these things as community and as individual, then the promise is we will be best. So it kind of incorporates everything about the spiritual journey. So I want to conclude by reminding you, because we're leaving this section of 4 chapters, by reminding you what the 4 main parts of this main section of the unpacking and the application of the original 10 commandments given over these last 4 chapters. If you remember, on the first day we dealt with the issues of bodily injury, even up to the point of murder. The second day, we dealt with the loss of property, and we saw how that should be arbitrated, whether there was damage to property or to people and their property. Then in the third section yesterday, we basically looked at the idea of how we should be gracious to one another, because ultimately God has been gracious to us. And now on this final section today, we've looked at the fact that we should be impartial and fair in everything we do. And within our system, we should make sure that it is set up in a fair way in order that just judgments at every level can be made. So to put it all together, it's really ultimately teaching us to be gracious and to be fair and to be just, which of course sums up the ethic of the Bible. God is holy, God is love, and this is reflected through the Bible, even right back here in the Mosaic Law. It's all here. Now, having said all that, I think we've basically explained yet the passage, but there is something within today's message I find particularly interesting, and I think it's worth just finishing off by unpacking this today as something we can really be helpful in understanding our own spiritual journey in life. And that is the phrase in verse 30 when he says, I'm going to give you the land little by little. So I want to leave our time together, not just today, but of these last few days, asking you to grab hold of and hold on to that thought. I think we all need to know that the principle is that God works little by little. Now, when it comes to the Christian life, there are many false ideas around about spiritual life and growth. Some preachers I listen to make it sound like the spiritual life is just a bunch of things that you should and should not do. And if you do these things, you're spiritual, and if you don't, you're not spiritual. But the thing I want you to walk away from, the big truth I want you to understand that is extrapolated from this passage, is that this true spiritual life, the true Christian life, is a life of growth. It's not a life of the instant. The biblical concept of the Christian faith is that we grow, and that takes time, and it's dependent on our exposure, if you like, to the Word of God. It doesn't happen all at once. God works in us little by little by revealing himself and his purpose and his plans for us in his life. In fact, one of the major problems in life is that as fallen human beings, we often get impatient. We want God to do things and sort things out straight away. We always want in a sense, God to hurry up. But God's plan is to do things little by little. Now, in my own life, what that has meant for me, I've decided, once I reached an understanding of that point, that my job in life should just be to teach the Bible, and then hopefully help some people just choose to sit down and listen and allow themselves to be transformed by making the study of the Bible part of the rhythm of their daily lives. You see, if you just sit and listen to the scripture and you have a heart for the Lord, whether it's listening to me or whether it's just in other ways, in other parts of your life, if you just do that and have a heart for the Lord, then I guarantee you, you will spiritually grow. Now, it may not be dramatic in the way some preachers promise, but what I can promise you is the growth will be real and it will be continual. So yesterday evening in my preparation for this passage today, and I'm always thinking, what is the application of what I've taught today? Well, what I'm telling you is that something that you can choose to do to really apply that is to make the decision to make the study of the Bible part of the rhythm of your daily life. And if you do that, I guarantee that will affect you. It will affect you dramatically. It'll affect you gradually, incrementally, but it will do it dramatically. You see, my real hope is that each and every one of you listening to me today will see the value of just making sure you take time to listen to the Word of God or to study the Word of God, because that is what will change your life. Friends, you just need to sit and be ready to hear, to study, to listen, to read the Scriptures, and it's amazing, utterly amazing, how that repeated exposure to the Word of God, you're just listening to what the Bible says and teaches, when you're repeatedly exposed to that, it does really affect you. It changes you, it transforms you, and it does it bit by bit. It's a bit like, you can't eat all the meals you need for growth in one go and then say, I don't need to eat again for the rest of your life. You can't even do that once a week. In fact, you might even struggle to do that by just eating once a day. We know we're sustained in life by eating 3 meals a day. Well, maybe God is calling you to be exposed to His Word multiple times a day. And then God can truly transform you, because He can reveal His truth to you, transform you, change you, and He'll do that providentially, incrementally, little by little. But over the fullness of time, you can see, and others will see, the most amazing and complete transformation of a single life. Okay, that's it for today. I do hope you find that helpful. I know it was a long one, it was a very long passage, but I wanted to try and get through it all in one go. So I do hope that you found it helpful, and I do hope that I'll see you back here again tomorrow. Don't forget, the podcast is hosted on thebibleproject.buzzsprout.com. That's the place where you can get access to all the active links to the other free resources, and you can connect with the ministry. But you can subscribe to it and follow it along anywhere that you receive your podcasts from. But I'll just leave it there with that today, and I'll say bye-bye, and I'll see you back here tomorrow, I trust, on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye now.